On some technical things right now, but we are going to get started because of timing. Welcome to the meeting 17 of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women. I call this meeting to order. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on Tuesday, February 1st, the committee will resume its study of resource development and violence against Indigenous women and girls. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format, pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Per the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on March 10th, 2022, all those attending the meeting in person must wear a mask, except for members who are at their place during proceedings. I would like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice of on the bottom of your screen. There is floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use your earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. So I know that we have two of our witnesses online. I know that we're working to get our third online, but I would really like to welcome our witnesses for this part of our study. On our witness panel today, we have, as an individual, Ellen Gabriel from the Indigenous Land Defender from Kaneshaki, and if you can make sure you say that properly, it's really important that I get that proper. From the National Family of Survivors Circle, Hilda Anderson Pires, who is the chair. And right now we're still working on the York Factory First Nation. So as soon as we see that they're online, we'll be introducing them and welcoming them as well. What we'll be doing is we'll be providing 5 minutes for opening comments to all of the witnesses. You'll start seeing me rolling my green pen saying wrapping it up, and I'll just put up a little note or try to cut you off, but I'll give you 1 minute warning when you are down to your last minute. I am going to now turn the floor over to Ellen. Ellen, you will have the floor for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Greetings to everybody. I'm from the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk community of Kanesatake, which is an hour north of Montreal. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this process. The right to dignity and security of life are the hallmarks of the enjoyment of human rights. All human rights are indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent, a fact that complements Indigenous peoples' laws and customs. For decades, Indigenous women have been active participants in the protection and promotion of our human rights and that of our families and nations. We have been at the helm of positive changes for equality and equity in regards to Indigenous peoples' human rights. From the Mohawk women who stood on the front lines on July 11th in 1990 without weapons against a paramilitary force of the SQ Army, a SWAT team, to the tiny house warriors and Wet'suwet'en women brutalized by a paramilitary trained RCMP force, we are active participants in the defense of our human rights, our homelands, families, and nations. And yet we remain marginalized under a systemic racist framework of the Indian Act that continues to define who we are as a peoples and who decides who is a legitimate person to speak. While there have been many nice words declaring the respect of Indigenous peoples' human rights through legislation, to protect Indigenous languages, or to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, there still remains no change in the status quo. Legislation must be based on a human rights perspective, not solely on words nor funding. Instead, we are forced into quotas, numbers, and timeframes, rather than the cost of damages to our family units, languages, lands, culture, and governing structure. Systemic racism forces us into Canada's costly court system as the colonial praxis remains the basis of our relationship. The brutality of colonialism should be a thing of the past, but sadly, it is not. In fact, when I spoke to former Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Carolyn Bennett, requesting a moratorium on development in Kanesatake or Oka, she said no, and if you don't like it, I should take them to court. Indigenous women land defenders are made more vulnerable by man camps and a society ignorant of the multi-generational impacts of trauma. Again, we are denied our enjoyment of our rights through costly court systems. I know I only have 5 minutes. I'll skip some of just to let the interpreters know. In order for Indigenous peoples' languages, cultures, and identity to survive, we must have access to our lands and resources. The rights to development threaten our existence as Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Indigenous peoples must constantly fight to protect our lands, waters, and natural resources. Now is the time to put action into words. There has to be a movement to bring the political rhetoric to an actual decolonial framework and relationship in order to help Indigenous peoples protect them on the front lines and protect our security and who we are as the First Peoples of Turtle Island. Canada and its provinces must work together to create genuine reconciliation. We are proud of the many survivors of the Indian residential school who courageously gave public testimonies of the abuses they suffered as children, and by government entities and church entities. And we cannot forget the thousands of Indigenous children who never came home and whose bodies lie in unmarked graves across Canada. From the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Peoples to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Murdered and the Commission on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, we know the way forward. We know what needs to be done. And these recommendations need to be implemented, not just through legislation. It is the cultural bureaucracy of Canada and its provinces who have been most negligent in their duty to uphold the highest standards of human rights and to implement these recommendations. As Indigenous land defenders, we do not seek power. We are mindful that our needs cannot interfere with the needs of present and future generations for the faces not yet born. And without access to our lands, we cannot transmit traditional knowledge of our languages, our cultures, and our governing structures. We are trying to protect the land and waters for present and future generations. And I just want to say something about due diligence, which I learned from Cheryl Lightfoot, who is a professor at UBC. Due diligence is preventative. The purpose of due diligence is first and foremost to avoid causing or contributing to adverse impacts on Indigenous peoples, the environment, and society, and to seek to prevent adverse impacts directly linked to operations, products, or services through business relationships. We need to have good intentions to become actions. We no longer need rhetoric. We need to stop the police brutality that is done on behalf of corporations who do not respect Indigenous peoples' human rights and our rights to self-determination. Thank you for listening to me, Skana, and wishing you all peace. Tony Kawanaga, these are my words.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. We're now going to move the floor over to Hilda Anderson Perez, National Family and Survival Circle. Make sure you just take your time. I know that you've got maybe have a glass of water there with you if you need, but we'll work through this. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks. I wasn't actually sure if I'd have a voice to do this because of my throat thing going on right now. So I just quickly wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Treaty 1 territory, and I'm Cree from Nissitawasset Cree Nation. I just wanted to share a little bit about the National Family and Survivor Circle. We're a group of amazing Indigenous women from across Canada who have been brought together in August of 2020 to support the development of the National Action Plan. So we're really looking forward to, continuing this important sacred work that we have. We use our strength and lived expertise as family members and survivors of gender-based violence to advocate for the process that is moving forward with respect to the National Inquiry final report into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Sorry, I'll have to clear my throat a bit. So all actions must come from a rights-based approach. Everyone has the right to live in dignity and safety and to maintain and practice their identity and culture. Under international human rights law, states are obligated to do everything they can to ensure that rights essential to individual and collective well-being, such as the rights to education, health, livelihood, and the right to live free from violence can be fully realized in the lives of all people without discrimination. All governments are expected to take every reasonable measure to stop human rights violations, including preventing crimes and abuses committed by private actors such as corporations and individuals. Where rights have been violated, states have an obligation to ensure justice by acknowledging the harm, assisting the victims in their recovery, and preventing the harms from being repeated. When resource development is occurring, Indigenous communities do not have the infrastructure, leadership capacity, or expertise to respond to the rapid social changes violence, and population growth. Consequently, local resources are drained, dealing with crime, substance abuse, health problems, and the stress placed on human service organizations and public services due to increased demand for services. Sorry. And an insufficient capacity to meet those demands. Increased social responsibility by the state and companies who are profiting from resource extraction must be mandatory in all agreements. Many reports have clearly demonstrated the intersectionality of resource development and violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA plus people. Yet recommendations fail to be implemented and the violence continues. Shireen Razak identifies resource extraction as the heart of colonial violence. She goes on to say that while white men are not explicitly mentioned, as it is only the transient worker when referring to mining camp workers, we know there is a culture of impunity in this location. Racism in the oil patch can be obvious and sometimes subtle. It is important to ask, what does the violence do? What is it about? Why is racism and violence such an everyday anticipated activity on resource extraction? Colonial histories have led to this. It is a genocidal impulse. Drawing from Shireen Razak's work, she has also identified it's critical to understand how colonial power is imprinted on Indigenous bodies. It is the raw material for the making of the settler state from which it manufactures power. Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA plus people should never suffer for the state's economic prosperity. It is often the voices of those who are most impacted that are absent from the table, and the silence is deafening for those who are being victimized during resource development projects. Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA plus people must be part of advisory circles from the territory where resource extraction is occurring, and safety and accountability mechanisms must be included in all legally binding agreements. And the National Family and Survivor Circle has identified 4 pillars in our contribution to the National Action Plan. I'm just going to clear my throat. These 4 pillars are fundamental in properly applying the principles of change from the National Inquiry final report and should be utilized in all resource agreements. So the pillar of inclusion, full and informed involvement of MMIWG2S families and survivors of gender-based violence, centering their lived experience, recognizing their agency, knowledge, experience, and expertise as valuable and as a key part in the information guiding all decisions, and interconnectedness. This principle reflects and reinforces the Indigenous understanding that everyone and everything has a purpose. The root cause of violence, as well as the solutions to ending it, are also interconnected. It is the lived experience of families and survivors that is the thread that brings to light the root causes and the solutions. Accountability. There must be the will to support and carry out transformative change at all levels. Mechanisms and forums to report on actions taken are essential to hold all governments, agencies, organizations accountable.
Hilda, I know you have only one more pillar. If you want to just mention the pillar, but we are way over time. So if you just want to mention your last pillar.
And then the impact is creating meaningful impact at multiple levels to effectively build, gain, and sustain momentum required for transformative change needed to end the genocide. And I in the writing part of it, I shared links on the reports. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm now going to move the floor over, and I'd like to welcome from the York Factory First Nation, Martina Saunders, who is the Community Engagement Coordinator. You weren't here when I began, but you'll have 5 minutes to speak. I'll start kind of getting you to wrap up, and then I'll interrupt when we do need to stop. So I'm going to pass the floor over to you, Martina. You have it for 5 minutes.
Tansei, good afternoon, Senate, and everyone who is joining us today. My name is Martina Saunders. I'm an Ininu Iskweo Cree woman from York Factory First Nation. I am appearing before you today on behalf of York Factory First Nation and the MMIWG 2S Plus Implementation Committee of Manitoba. As many of you may be aware, York Factory First Nation entered a partnership with Manitoba Hydro on the Kias project on the Nelson River of the Treaty 5 territory in northern Manitoba. Our First Nation was focused on bettering the livelihood of our Cree Nation when we participated as best we could in the project planning and environmental assessment process of the Kias project. York Factory First Nation quickly learned of covert and overt racism, sexism, homophobia, and sexual violence experienced by our Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people in these hydroelectric projects as a result of this historical and ongoing relationship with Manitoba Hydro. Not only have our women, young women, and Two-Spirit people experienced these human rights abuses, our women, including myself, have faced bullying, harassment, racism, and discrimination at the corporate offices of Manitoba Hydro by industry workers in the urban center of Winnipeg, Manitoba. These acts of violence and human rights abuses occurred decades ago and most recently as a few years ago. These experiences have caused a lot of harm and trauma and have impacted our people in horrific ways. We continue to call on the provincial and territorial governments to act on our calls for a public inquiry into the racism, harassment, discrimination, and sexual violence in northern hydroelectric development projects in northern Manitoba. We need to examine and understand the structural and systemic factors that continue to harm our people, but most importantly, our murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. We ask that gender-based analysis be a part of all industry approval assessment processes, which will allow us to view any proposed resource extraction project through an Indigenous worldview, ways of being, and through a decolonized approach. Those are my notes that I put together. I don't know if I used my 5 minutes.
You've got about a minute left.
Okay.
We can end now if you want to take more questions, but if you do have a couple things, go for it.
Okay, I'll end now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, no, thank you, Martina. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we'll be starting our rounds of questions. So for each party, they'll be provided 6 minutes for the first round. So we're going to start off with Michelle Frary. Michelle, you have 6 minutes of questions. I'll pass the floor over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And I think on record, I'd love to have it said that we want this to do this study so that we can invest in resource development, to reduce poverty, to put resources into the communities, but we also have to be due diligent that no one is harmed, that we are doing due diligence, that these companies are held to account. So my first question is to you, Martina. The National Inquiry's Call for Justice 13.4 calls for a public inquiry into the sexual violence and racism at hydroelectric projects in northern Manitoba. Can you explain the importance of holding a public inquiry into the violence and racism at these projects?
Is that for Martina?
Martina, yeah, I think she's on mute. You're on mute, Martina, sorry.
You're still on. Yep, you're good.
Okay. It's important that we examine these human rights abuses so that that these atrocities don't happen again. We need to understand that, like, coming from an Indigenous perspective and being marginalized, in northern Manitoba, there's a lack of resources like education, healthcare, things that would help us to live more. I'm more better lives, I guess. We're at a disadvantage in northern Manitoba, but like it's hard to understand when these acts of violence are happening to us, and we want to join the broader conversation of how resource development impacts Indigenous people, not only in Manitoba or through Manitoba Hydro, but in Canada or across the globe.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martina. I hear accountability for sure, and I think that's critical. Ellen, if I could move to you, one of the policies that I know we'd like to see on the Conservative side is for Indigenous, by Indigenous, being involved in the conversations and being leaders at the table for the decisions that are made. What types of activities could help mitigate the impacts of temporary work camps and worker influxes, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think if there was the real respect for free, prior, and informed consent, that kind of process, that would save a lot of people a lot of trouble. It's part of the international human rights norms to understand what is going on, how is it going to impact our rights as Indigenous peoples, how is it going to impact the environment, because part of Indigenous law is to protect the environment. And it's really simple. It's sitting down, having everybody who is a rights holder to be able to make a decision on what kind of development takes place on our territories, on our lands, what are the consequences, and for businesses to understand that we have the right to withhold consent if we feel that it is a serious infraction and serious consequences to the environment and to the health and well-being of the people. And we need to there has to be a real effort to be able to understand Indigenous people's perspectives when it comes to this.
Thank you very much. I know I don't have much time, so I'm going to switch to Hilda. Hilda, obviously some key priorities of our government right now are housing, transportation, economic development. These are, critical for everybody, and especially in the more rural areas of Canada, transportation is critical. My question to you is, how could the Government of Canada help ensure Indigenous women and girls living in communities close to resource extraction projects have increased access to shelters if they need to escape violence?
Well, I think, first of all, there has to be shelters built in the communities, because many of the First Nations across this country, even in rural locations, do not have shelters. The shelters are very limited. So I think that's the first step, is to ensure that there is a shelter built so that victims can have access to that support. So that I would recommend that being the first initial step. And, providing not only for the infrastructure for building, but for operational requirements too, and, for training of staff who are working in those shelters to be able to fully support victims who come forward. So I would say, the reality is there is not many shelters across the country, especially when we're looking at Indigenous communities where we see major resource projects occurring. So the first step is, investing in the building of shelters and the infrastructure and the operational dollars and training of staff.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm now going to pass the floor to Jenna Suds, who's online. Jenna, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chair. And my sincere thanks to Ellen, Hilda, Martina. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom as we go through this study, and for the important work, of course, that you are doing. My first question is for Martina. Martina, you very eloquently said how important it is that Indigenous views are reflected as resource extraction projects are considered, and you referenced the colonized approach. I would love for you to take a minute to further expand on your statements there.
Okay, a decolonized approach, not a colonized approach. That would include our Cree worldview. If we're coming from my Cree nation, when I look at it in the context of doing a public inquiry, it's being validated, is having our stories heard, and that brings healing for our people. We can't move forward if these abuses and acts of sexual violence are not acknowledged by the government and by industry, by Manitoba Hydro. So we need to use an Indigenous approach. What that means to us is to include ceremony and to practice our culture when we're doing this work, and making sure that it's a trauma-informed approach, and not to bring more harm to victims, let's say, of sexual violence. So in doing it this way, it using our protocols that we follow in ceremony and that are meaningful to us in our culture, that's how we see it as healing, and to like acknowledge it, and for an apology or apologies to happen to people who are harmed. And of course, we know that it doesn't only stop at the person who was harmed, but it impacts the family system. It impacts the whole community. It impacts the whole nation. So it isn't just these individual acts of violence. And when we use our culture and ceremony, it includes all of those. It isn't just for one.
I agreed. And you mentioned the family unit. So I noticed as I was reading a bit about the work that's happening at York Factory First Nations, I noted the Aboriginal Head Start program. And, I'm wondering if you can speak to the impact that this has had in the community.
The impact that it's had in the community. I've seen this project from different angles. And I've been home most recently, and we have a huge problem with addictions in our community. And I see how it's impacted the different groups in the community. Like when I visit my mother, I can see the impacts of the addictions that it has on her. I've spent some time with her recently. Now, prior to this, I didn't notice those changes before, but being home most recently, I can see how it's changed people. There's been a lot of family breakdown. We've recently lost one of our family members through violence and alcohol and addiction. And it's very sad to see that. And of course, you know, this impacts our children. You know, it impacts the young people.
Of course, yes, and I'm sorry to hear how it's impacted your family. I know I don't have much time left. I just wanted to pick up very quickly on with Alan, if I may. Alan, you had made the comment that of course we have the right to withhold consent when it comes to project and protecting the environment. And I'd like to hear your perspective as to how to go about to achieve that as projects are being proposed.
I'm just going to let you know, Ellen, you have about 20 seconds to get this answer. So about 20 seconds, okay?
The right to have some sort of legal remedy is also included in free, prior, and informed consent. And as I said, development, we're living through a climate crisis. And I think that part of the deal is that we should be assimilating you into Indigenous laws and customs and protocols, because it's always us who have to fit into the box. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move it over to Sylvie with the block. Sylvie, you have 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to start by thanking the 3 witnesses for their very important presentations and the interpreters for their great work. My question is for Ms. Gabriel. You talked about Indigenous customs and languages and culture and identity and respect. With this study, we're trying to find solutions. We want concrete solutions that the government needs to take on for its responsibility, but we see the opposite with the report from the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the government does not seem to be following up. Should the government put an end to the Indian Act and having Indigenous people at the table, nation to nation, for reconciliation?
Thank you for the question. I'm sorry, I'm more comfortable to respond in English. I think that one of the problems that we are having is that political leaders, judges, lawyers, social workers, educators are not really reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. All the work has been done for people to be on the same page and to understand each other's perspective. Yes, we want to get rid of the Indian Act. It is probably the only existing racist piece of legislation that exists in this world today. That doesn't mean that we have the answers on how to replace it. If we're going to deal nation to nation, then the government needs to get rid and stop legitimizing the band council system in which these are the only people that it recognizes as the legal authorities. The Rudinuseshaga or Haudenosaunee people of the Longhouse of the Iroquois Confederacy is a governing system that has survived colonization. And so traditional governments need to be included in any discussions that affect our homelands, that affect our rights. It's not up to Canada to decide who is the legitimate authority. So I think there is amongst us as Indigenous people, we need to discuss what that means when we get rid of the Indian Act. But it definitely has to be a human rights-based approach. We have to use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and all the international human rights norms that go with it. Getting rid of the Indian Act does not mean that we are surrendering our land title by any means. We still have to provide, some respect and defend the rights of future generations who will be dealing with the legacy of this climate crisis that we're facing. But the Indian Act does not mean, getting rid of the Indian Act does not mean that you're getting rid of our rights. It's not even protected under Canada's Constitution Act of 1982, in spite of the fact that it says it respects the existing rights. rights that existed before 1982. It's just like a quagmire of legal implications that I think demands more than just reflection. I think there should be a study on what that means in getting rid of the Indian Act. I come from a community where the Band Council provided a 33-year lease to a toxic waste dump, which we are dealing with, and which no member of parliament, except for Elizabeth May, is willing to advocate on our behalf. A toxic waste dump that will take at least 10,000 years to clean up, all from the debris and raw sewage from the island of Montreal. So that's the kind of precarious situations that we face because of the Indian Act. So it's not as easy to just get rid of this legislation. It has to be a human rights-based approach, and it has to complement and it has to be based as well on Indigenous peoples' human rights law and our constitutions. Thank you.
Pouvez-vous nous expliquer aussi?
Can you also explain what can be done concretely so that Indigenous women and girls in communities that are close to resource extraction sources are no longer victims of violence?
Je me demandais aux trois témoins.
And that question is for all three of the witnesses, please.
You have to have free, prior, and informed consent. I'm going to keep going back to that, because if that's ignored, we're going to continue to be put in these threatening situations in which Indigenous women are vulnerable to these man camps. And I'm sure Hilda would like to answer that question as well. But you have to begin on a good note. You have to begin the process in good faith and openness and respect of human rights, especially Indigenous people's right to self-determination.
I'm not sure how much time is left.
Go ahead. Yeah, so Hilda, I'll give you 20 seconds, then we'll go to Martina for 20 seconds, and that our whole time will be over.
So I think the first key thing that needs to happen is to invite Indigenous women, girls, and to us people to the table, ensure that there's equity and equality when they're sitting at those tables. They have to ensure that they are central to any type of resource development that is occurring within their territory. They have the answers. They know what they need and what they want and what it takes to keep them safe.
Awesome.
So
And
it's important to involve them.
And Martina, if you want to answer, you've got about 20 seconds. Unfortunately on mute.
I'll add that there is a need for victim services within these industry camps, man camps, hydro camps, because if women or two-spirit people are being violated, they're like, I'll give an example. If they're working in catering and housekeeping, then one of the, like, I'll use housekeeper as an example, was violated, then she would have to, or he would have to, report to the manager, and the manager is going to be, in our case, it was Sodexo manager. So they would have to go and approach a top chef, and it's not even in his job or his responsibilities to deal with sexual violence, and it just gets lost. Plus there's no trust there. So we need victim services in these camps where victims can go and they know and they trust that they're going to be heard and validated and not be afraid of their bosses or Manitoba Hydro.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm now going to turn it over to Leah Gazan. Leah, you have 6 minutes.
Thanks so much, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today for this very important study that I'm really honored to have our committee be so open to study. I wanted to start with Ellen Gabriel. You wrote a column for the Ricochet discussing the violence against Indigenous land defenders, and you wrote this, in quotes, "Reconciliation cannot happen as long as the colonial project," you were referring to the use of Indigenous homelands for profit and the violence against land and water defenders, and the violence it inflicts exists. Only through understanding human rights and the Indigenous laws that protect the environment and all our relationships can we move forward. In the spirit of this, how can human rights and Indigenous laws be upheld to move forward together and ensure that Indigenous women, girls, 2S, LGBTQIA individuals, and land defenders remain safe from violence, particularly women on the front lines?
Okay, if I understand your question correctly. So in order to have safety, we have to have policing authorities also be able to do their jobs in a way that they understand human rights. But the colonial project is, in fact, overriding and oppressing and suppressing traditional knowledge, traditional rights. Our human rights are being sacrificed for the sake of economic development. We are ostracized. We face racism by the non-Indigenous communities that we live next to. So the only way to do this is to education and dialogue, not pamphlets, not reports that, it has to go beyond the reports and the rhetoric. We need safety within the communities that will provide knowledge about what colonialism has done. That this colonial project that we keep referring to is profoundly understood, as mentioned in the Royal Commission, as mentioned in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and MMIW. To be safe, I really don't know. I've been doing this for 32 years and I do not feel safe in the community that I grew up in because the town of Oka rides roughshod over us. The Minister of Indian Affairs refuses to include the Longhouse in any negotiations. They refuse to put a moratorium on development so that we can at least sit down at the table in an atmosphere of peace. If we are not sitting down at the table in an atmosphere of peace, we are under pressure. It is coercive. So we have to undo this and look at a human rights-based perspective about the dignity and worth of a human being and provide those safety measures so that we can speak in safety, so that we can speak with honesty, but starting from the same page where we are aware of the impacts of multi-generational trauma. It wasn't just our languages and cultures that were attacked, it was our homelands. It was the lands that upon which our whole languages and our identity is based upon. But I know that for me, in my community, we cannot call the police. There is nobody to come help us when there is violence in the community. And INAC is very much aware. Minister Miller said that they are very aware that the community I come from is imploding. We have organized crime of every kind that you can imagine in this community, and nobody is willing to help us. So this committee should actually act on this and decide, like, what would you do if you yourself were in my position where you are not safe in the community that you grew up in and in which thousands of generations have been here before?
Thank you so much. And I think also pointing out you are an elder in our community that does not feel safe is telling, and something that I'm glad that you shared with the committee. And I know, Martina, you were talking about bullying and harassment, and I know there was a former security staff from Manitoba Hydro worksite at the kiosk camp near Gillam who came forward in 2018 to report incidents of racism and sexual assault, smuggling of alcohol and drugs on the job site, and violence he witnessed on the camp. And when he alerted managers of these incidents, he was brushed aside and allowed the violence to continue unaddressed. This seems to closely align with experiences that you've shared, Martina, experiences of bullying after raising issues of racism and discrimination during your time as the VP on the board of directors for the KS Hydro partnership. Could you please speak about the harm that, as much as you feel comfortable, that's perpetrated by patriarchal, colonial, and the violent mindset of senior staff in a lot of these developments, and resource development initiatives, and how you feel it should be addressed? I know you talked about sexual assault centers. Do you have any other recommendations, especially with what Ellen Gabriel said, saying we have nowhere to go, we are not safe, and we have nobody to go? know where to go.
You've got about 20 seconds. I'll give you about 30 seconds if you can go. Go ahead, Martina.
I think, like, I'm thinking about my experience and my First Nations experience in negotiating the JKDA with Manitoba Hydro. Like there were no women at all those tables. Like it was mostly men. There was an imbalance already of hydro workers and the First Nation partners. But when you look at like the gender-based analysis of that, like who were the seats for? The Indigenous seats were mostly made up of Indigenous men. So we didn't have two-spirit people there. We didn't necessarily always have women's voices there. The same with the board of directors for the KHLP, where I was a VP. We need to have our voices at the planning of these projects if they have to happen. We don't want these projects to happen, but if they're gonna happen, then they need to be done in a way where they're not harming our people and we're being heard, not just like Indigenous men's voices at the table.
Martina, I'm going to have to cut you off. We've gone about a minute over there, so sorry about that. I just want to get back on track. So thank you so much. So we'll start our next round of questions. So I'm going to pass the floor over to Shelby for 5 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining and sharing your testimony. I have questions or comments for each one of you. I'll start by suggesting to Martina, I want to thank you for sharing your story with regards to your family loss due to violence and addiction. That's never a nice one to stomach, so I do appreciate your willingness to be open about that. Ellen, Gabrielle, if I may, thank you as well for being so open and forthright. I'll start specifically with some of your remarks and with a couple questions. You had mentioned the importance of education and dialogue and the need for, pamphlets can often just be an empty rhetoric, is not accomplishing anything. And you also suggested that for decades, Indigenous women have been active participants in the protection and promotion of our human rights and that of our family and nations, and that we've been at the helm of positive changes for equality and equity in regards to Indigenous people's human rights. So my question is two-part. What kind of framework, when you speak of the human rights approach, do you see ideal? And I recognize that demands are, you need more demands and not just reflection. So that's the first part. And second, you mentioned that legislation should be based more on human rights and not solely words. Instead of focusing on quotas and timeframes, we should be focusing more on family units, languages, and lands. I personally think it should be more a combination of the two. I think we can't have one without the other. So if you could speak to that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I like where you're going with this. It's impossible to do this in 5 minutes. I've been looking at some of the legislation regarding the implementation of the UN Declaration, and there's parts I think that Indigenous people were not happy with, but it still goes back to this imposition of sovereignty of Canada. And Canada's refusal to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, which means that we are Indigenous people without the S. Our right to self-determination is extremely important. And I'm very sincere when I said we should be assimilating you, because the education about the love for the land, how important the environment is, how we discuss things in a way that is respectful, I think those are some of the essentials of a framework where we can progress and move forward. But a framework is very simple under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that acknowledges the harms that have been done because of colonization, because of racism, because of genocide, and to bring people, as has been mentioned previously, of all genders, to be sitting at the table, to contribute. But as people who are knowledgeable, legislation, even with the languages component, we're talking about 2-year frameworks. Our first language speakers that have that think in the language, we are losing them. We don't have that luxury of time to be able to say, like, in 2 years' time, let's look and see where the Indigenous Languages Act is. It's always based on Canada's needs, not upon the needs of Indigenous peoples, or to examine the harms that have been done because of colonization and because of the genocidal project.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Complicated.
Thank you. It was a several part question, so we need an hour. But in the spirit of time, I will move forward to ask Hilda a question with regards to the National Inquiry Call for Action. And I'm just wondering if you could enlighten us as to which ways you could see we could progress towards implementing the actual call to action, and how could it be improved?
Okay, thank you so much. I think one of the key things that has to occur immediately is that there has to be an accountability mechanism put into place, like specifically Call for Justice 1.7 with the ombudsperson, because right now, there's no real accountability mechanism in place that will measure what calls for justice have been actioned, and there has to be a framework for reporting as well, in conjunction with the ombudsperson. Because right now, like we see, like I can see across the country right now, there has been little to really no action, with all the provinces and territories and the federal and Indigenous governments as well when it comes to the implementation of the 231 calls for justice. And in saying that, we have seen an increase in violence against Indigenous women and girls in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And governments have shown how nimble they can be, when in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we need them to be as equally nimble with respect to protecting the lives of Indigenous women and girls in the 2S community, because women and girls are dying and the 2S people are dying at alarming rates. So the key thing is an accountability mechanism. That's what we really need, and holding governments accountable to see where they're at and what calls for justice that have been implemented.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move it over, and I'm just going to move it over for 5 minutes to Anita Vandenbeld. Anita, online for 5.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all of the witnesses. My first question is for Ms. Saunders. I'd just like to pick up a little bit about what you were saying about your experience. We often talk about the need to have Indigenous women at the table in order to give voice, but your experience shows that just being at the table does not guarantee meaningful voice and meaningful participation. Often women end up, in your case and others, bullied and then vacating that space. How do we make sure that women, Indigenous women, can be empowered so that they feel protected, so that there is actual agency and actually have meaningful participation when and if they do choose to be part of and participate and be at the table? How do we do that? And in particular, as legislators, how do we ensure that this is happening when sometimes this is happening through private actors?
When I think about my experience on the KHLP Board of Directors, there was no place for me to go to report the bullying, the racism. First off, there was a power imbalance at that table, and it shouldn't be that way. And there needs to be an independent process, like aside from industry, where we can go and feel safe and heard and make sure that whatever is happening, there's some action taken to help us to be at these tables and continue to do the work, because our voices are very important.
Thank you very much. And I think that certainly would be something that we may wish to recommend as a committee. I do want to move over now to Ms. Anderson-Perez about some of the things that you said in your testimony. You talked about a human rights-based approach and then about what happens when those rights are violated. And I think if I heard correctly, there were three things in particular. There's the acknowledgement of the harm, and then the assistance to the survivors. But then you mentioned also preventing it from being repeated. And I'd like to hone in on that particular piece. What is it? And again, thinking about what we can do as legislators to create the overarching structure for this, how do we prevent these things from happening in the first place?
I think, what it really boils down to is policies and legislations that have accountability mechanisms to hold perpetrators and companies and governments responsible, but also bringing Indigenous women and girls and the two us people to the table, and centering their voices and actioning what they're sharing on what prevention and safety looks like to them, but also, providing that equity and equality for even meaningful participation when resource development is occurring. When we look at, poverty, often can lead to the perpetuation of violence as well. If we give opportunity, for education, housing, childcare, opportunities for employment, like that's what a lot of prevention looks like, because we're providing strength-based approaches, right, to supporting Indigenous women, girls, and the 2S people within the communities who are being impacted by resource development. But I think also there has to be mechanisms put into place and training, on violence prevention and what is violence, what is human trafficking, what is sexual exploitation, because sometimes people do not understand the types of violence that is occurring out there, but also it's also an opportunity, even in schools, when there's resource extraction happening, like educating teens, even younger children, like what does violence look like? What does grooming look like? What does human trafficking look like? What does sexual exploitation look like? We need to really focus on an education piece, but also grounding Indigenous women and 2S people and who they are and where they come from, and providing those opportunities to, anchor themselves in their land, their culture, their language, because these are really strength-based approaches. And when we know resource extraction, when it occurs, it often takes away many of these things. And we also need like opportunities for healing, right? Because we've been impacted by intergenerational trauma as well. So there's many things that are needed, but those are just some of the things that I can share right now in essence of time. But I could talk about this for like 2 days on what prevention can look like. Yeah. So thank you.
Very, very helpful. I really appreciate that. If you do have more that you didn't get a chance, more recommendations, please do write to the committee. And also Ms. Saunders and Ms. Gabriel as well, if we didn't get a chance to get to you, because I think, Madam Chair, I'm out of time.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I know you wanted to just mention that they can send it, and that's always a reminder. We are having great conversations, but if there's additional information, please send it our way. You're providing great details today. I'm now going to move the time over for 2.5 minutes to Sylvie. Sylvie, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for the three witnesses. We've been talking about resource exploitation projects, but have they implemented measures to limit the negative impacts of resource exploitation on Indigenous women and girls, in your view?
You to go, so I'm going to go Martina, Hilda, and then Martina, Hilda, and then Ellen, okay?
If I'm expected to answer that question, I don't understand what language it was spoken in.
Was the interpretation, did you know English interpretation came through? Is that what I'm understanding?
I don't see where it's supposed to.
Martina, okay. So did you hear it in French, perhaps?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So we need to turn your interpretation to show the language on there. At the bottom, you're going to have interpretation, and it's going to show your option of the floor of English or French. Do you see that, Martina, at the bottom?
Interpretation, okay.
Yep. Okay, and now choose English.
Okay.
And let's try that again, okay? I'll say I put it on hold, but I got the time going in my head. I'm going to ask Sylvie to put the question back to you, and Martina, give me a thumbs up if you hear it, okay? Go ahead, Sylvie.
So, when we're talking about resource exploitation projects and companies, have they put in place measures to limit the negative impacts of resource exploitation on Indigenous women and girls?
Martina, were you able to hear it that time? Fantastic. So we're going to start off with you for the answer, and then Hilda, and then end to Ellen. Go ahead, Martina.
I know that they did try and help with the issue of violence against Indigenous women and girls. They tried to help with bringing in people. There was a meeting that happened in my community, and they brought in outside resources. And I know one of them had to do with addictions. Another one was, I think it was to promote healthy lifestyles. I wasn't at the community meetings myself. I had already finished working for my First Nation. But when I looked at that, I thought, like, there's nobody from the community that's speaking to those issues, or that can help plan those types of services. And bringing people from the outside has never worked for us. We need, like, we know what we need. Like, we're our own, for lack of a better word, healers. Like, we know ourselves best, and we just lack the resources. We lack the resources, and the budgets that go along with all of this. But it's more from a Western view. That's how I interpreted it. We need our own Indigenous ways of healing, and I'll say again, we lack those resources. We don't have the money to pay for all the things that we need.
Hilda, if you want to add your thoughts on that.
Sure. I would say, from my opinion, and because I'm also from a hydro-impacted community, but I also sit nationally with the National Family and Survivor Circle, I would say there is not enough measures that have been put into place. It's very lacking. And it's almost like, when it comes to gender issues, they're often off the side of a desk when resource development projects are occurring. They have to be front and center, because like I mentioned previously, it's often the individuals who are most impacted where their voices are not at the table. And even I've seen a lot of struggles even in my advocacy where it's like you're pressuring governments, Manitoba Hydro, and even in other industries who are participating in these resource development projects. It's like, you meet with them and they'll like ask you to meet, but then there's never any action associated to what you're sharing that needs to take place when it comes to prevention, wellness, and healing when resource development projects are occurring in our communities. I'd say there's a lot of lip service and not enough action.
Sorry about this. Ellen, I'm going to give you just like 10 seconds, but we are so out of our time frame, but I'm just going to make it work. But Ellen, if you can just give us a few last comments, and then I'll pass the floor over to Leah. Just 15 seconds. I know that's not a lot.
No, there's nothing. It's very adversarial and racist.
Much. I'm now going to pass the floor over to Leah Gazan. We're about between 2.5 minutes to anywhere to 10. You never know. But
okay,
no, I'll pass the floor over to you, 2.5 minutes. Okay.
Thanks so much, Chair. So, I've heard Martina, you just said, like, we don't have the resources. Hilda Anderson-Pierce, you talked about we need an ombudsman, call to justice 1.7, and the lack of action, we're 3 years out from the national inquiry. There's been money allocated in a budget not being spent, whole pile of excuses. Meanwhile, we continue to deal with the most horrific violence, and this study particularly around resource extraction, zero in this budget to deal with this issue. Abhorrent from my perspective, especially listening to the stories that we're listening to in this study. It's like our lives or not having a life doesn't seem to matter very much. Hilda, you did an interview with Amnesty International and you spoke about the connection between resource development and violence against Indigenous women and girls Two-Spirit. And you noted that, in quotes, if there's activities happening in our territories, there needs to be mechanisms to protect us from all types of violence. We've heard from Ellen Gabriel and Martina Sanders, not there. Should this occur, so others can benefit economically. And I'm quoting you on this because I find since being elected in 2019 that they seem to want to uphold our human rights when it suits their political and economic interests, and then they just brush it aside when it doesn't, and at the brunt of it is Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit. So I wanted you to see if you agree with me on that. And to share what kind of mechanisms should be in place to protect Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and individuals of violence, and what you think the holdup is. Like, why are they sitting on all this money while we're dying on the streets?
I would say it's the lack of political will, that is creating all the inaction. There has to be political will. There's a lot of talk about transformative change, but it has to be equally matched with the political will to support that transformative change and to provide that resourcing, because there's a lot of inequity when it comes to addressing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. We're often invited to processes, but we don't have the same type of equity or equality to meaningfully participate and to, make our lived experience and our knowledge and our ways of being and knowing as Indigenous people come to fruition, because we don't have the resourcing to be able to do that. And it's often, coming from a Western-based approach on what is best for us when it comes to prevention. And I also think, we need to really look at and go back to communities as well who have been impacted by resource development, because they're left in a really sad state. Like I shared previously, I come from South Indian Lake, which is a resource impacted community too. And the devastating impacts that I see years later, it's like there's no hope in the community, and the women and the girls who were involved in the process of supporting their men, who lived off the land, were never compensated for resource development. So there's a lot of misogyny and patriarchy and how decisions are made. And I think that's a really big problem.
Thank you so much, Hilda. What we're going to do, because as I said, I've let time get all off the side. We're going to go for 4 minutes for the next round. So it'd be 4 minutes to Dominique, 4 minutes to Emanuela, 4 minutes to Sylvie, and 4 minutes to Leah. I'm going to be cutting you off at the 4 minute mark, okay? So no playing nice at the chair today. So anyway, I'm going to pass the floor over to Dominique. You've got 4.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us this afternoon. Your presentations have been very interesting, and it's a heavy topic to hear about all of this violence and the challenges that you're facing. I will forever be an optimist, and that's why we're here today. We believe that things can be improved, they can be better. During another committee, I said, and you mentioned it as well, it seems like it would be easy to move forward and to have at one table law enforcement so that they can change their attitude and support women so that they can report violence that they face. The community needs to be able to help these women as well and help find solutions. The company as well. I was a former Minister of Labor. I had to put in place measures for companies that needed to have policies against psychological and sexual harassment, and I understand the importance of allowing women to express themselves and work in a safe environment. But before doing that, we need to recognize what the problem is. I think that this is what will allow us to act, because we need to work with those different groups. You talked about funds. Martina, I heard you very well. I heard everything that all of you had to say, but having funds, will that force people to act? Will that force them to work together? Will we be changing mentalities? Will we be changing cultures and the ways of doing things? Will we allow women to report? Will we convince them to report more? This is not a question, it's a comment. And I believe that we shouldn't contrast the different players. We need to find common interests for everyone. So that's something that I had thought about, that I wanted to share with you. I feel like it should be simple to sit everyone at one table and say, we're going to change the way we're doing things. What do you think of this? Am I too optimistic?
Madame Anderson.
Miss Anderson?
Okay. I think, yes, you are too optimistic because, you know, as Indigenous women and girls and to us people, we've tried to sit at many tables and we're often silenced or not respected and our rights are not respected. It's almost sometimes that, you know, we're just brought to tables just to say that they met with us, but they're not valuing the contributions that we can bring to the tables. And I'm not going to say that all tables are like that, but I would say the majority of the tables that I've sat at have often just created a space for me, but not valued what I bring to the table. And I know that that has been the experience of many of my sisters across the country. And I know, like, I too remain hopeful that I will see like significant changes in my lifetime. That's why I continue to be such a strong advocate. So I don't give up that hope because I know generations are relying on this auntie to create change. So I sit at any table I'm invited to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm now going to move the floor over to Manuela, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being with us today to answer some of our questions and for your great testimony. I guess I'll begin with my first question, which is around safety of Indigenous communities and safety of women and girls. I'm going to switch to, sorry, the camera's here. So I guess my first question would go to Ms. Anderson-Piers, and it would be, I know that Budget 2021 had a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars set aside to support culturally responsive policing and community safety services in Indigenous communities. And I know that this funding was to be over 5 years. So there was $861 million over 5 years. And I'm wondering if you can tell me in the last couple of years what you've been able to see from that funding. And if you haven't, then I'm going to take a look myself at where it's gone. But I know that the money was in there for 2021 over 5 years. If you can let us know what has been done with that in your view.
I would say, you know, there has been some investments into Indigenous policing services. But one of the key things that I want to mention here is on how data is collected, like the way that data is currently collected. It's very hard to paint a picture of where the funding is going because it's not really capturing the realities of the investments. So I think we really need to look at data going forward, you know, especially if you're trying to measure outcomes. That's a critical component. And I would say that you know, that there has to be so much work done within policing agencies because right across the country during the national inquiry, policing came up repeatedly coast to coast to coast. And I see some, you know, police agencies trying to change and bringing Indigenous partners to the table and trying to self-reflect on their internal behaviors and policies and racism, really, that's what it really is. So I see some movement, but like I said, it's not happening fast enough as an Indigenous woman and seeing the devastating impacts on the ground.
Thank you very much. And I guess I have Okay. We saw that with, unfortunately, when we found out or when it was brought to light what happened with the residential schools and when unmarked graves were found, it hit the news and it hit schools across Canada. And I had so many students from my riding write to me because their teachers actually had them write letters to their MP. And it was beautiful, really, to see how passionate they were. They were angry at me because obviously they see me as their politician and they see me as their representative, and they were upset thinking, that it's my fault and that I should do better. And they were elementary students, and there was so much passion in their voice through these letters, and it was beautiful to see, and I was really happy that I was seeing it. What role do all of the witnesses on this panel think education could play, and really opening the eyes of our youth, because clearly there's been a movement of the younger populations, I think, and that's what I see, that a lot of people who write to me about Indigenous issues are a lot of the youth in my writing, even though it's not one that has much of an Indigenous population. It's still one that a lot of young people write to me about. So what can you tell me about that?
You've got about 20 seconds to respond. So I'm just going to right now call out Ellen. You've got about 10 seconds.
Education that tells the truth about Canada's colonial history. Okay. I think that if you tell the truth, that's a good starting place, because we don't want to see the rhetoric of what's being told in the schools today. So education is extremely important.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We're now going to pass the floor over to Sylvie. Sylvie, you have 4 minutes. Yep.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for Ms. Ellen. Earlier, you mentioned that we know that we're talking about reconciliation and colonialism. Can you tell us more about solutions for reasonable due diligence?
I'm not sure what reasonable due diligence means, but I think due diligence should be Indigenous-led. If it's affecting our rights. It needs to include, for sure, the interests of everybody. But according to our ways and our customs, we need to look at if our needs are going to be negatively impacting future generations and their needs. Those are kinds of the ways of due diligence that I think has an Indigenous-led perspective. But it is important for everybody to be sitting at the table. It is important that we're all on the same page and what we're talking about today, which is education, and for everybody to see those reports, whether they're corporations, politicians, judges, or whatever. So, yeah, I'll leave more time for other people to answer.
Oui. J'aurais aussi.
I have another question for you, Ellen. Earlier, you talked about the safety and protection of Indigenous women. Do you have any recommendations to help you with that?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to tackle is the elephant in the room, which is corrupt governments, corrupt organizations that come into our communities that threaten the safety and well-being of our people. And to implement free, prior, and informed consent, I've always said that a traditional warrior society in our communities needs to be there, not policing, but just people who, like we had an ERU that was protecting us during the pandemic from people who are not from the community from entering into the community. I don't want it to be that severe. But there needs to be an understanding that we are human beings, and that, as the most marginalized group in society, we need extra protection. What that means is we need to sit down and discuss that and change the mentality of society in its attitude towards Indigenous women, so that we can be safe when we walk in our community. We can be safe on our homelands, even if it's in parks. But, it's 2022. I've been doing this for 32 years. I have not felt less, I feel more vulnerable than I did 32 years ago during the crisis in my community. And that says a lot, simply because of the organized crime that has been allowed to perpetrate and infiltrate our community because of the Indian Act and the lack of awareness and lack of political will to actually fix the over 300-year-old land dispute that we have in my community. So it's a complicated question and a complicated answer.
Ma question, ce sera pour Madame Hilda.
My next question is for Ms. Hilda. You talked about 4 pillars for a national action plan. Can you explain this national action plan to us further, please?
You got about 20 seconds.
Okay, so I only have 20 seconds. The 4 pillars come from the National Family and Survivors Circle chapter, and I actually shared it in the document that was written because you'll learn a lot more about the 4 pillars. But I think, if those 4 pillars were applied to all kinds of different approaches when we're looking at addressing gender-based violence prevention, wellness, and healing, I think they could be very instrumental.
Perfect.
So
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I know our analysts and I too have received that. So it does show the 4 pillars. We'll make sure that you are able to see that. I'm now going to pass it over to Leah Gazan. Leah, you've got the last 4 minutes.
Thank you so much. My last question is for Ellen Gabriel. You talked about human beings, and I can't help but think of the Indian Act, which defined a person as any other individual besides an Indian. As a person, as a human being. And I think, especially for Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit, we're still struggling with that, just being recognized as a human being. Misogyny and patriarchy, making decisions. You talked about the land dump, the toxic waste dump that's happened in your community. Often these decisions are made void of the voices of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit. They just happen. So my question for you is, when governments are going into communities and making agreements, who should they look to as the decision-making body? Should it just be chief and councils, or do they need to really understand what free, prior, and informed consent is and really do proper consultations with the community, and especially Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirits?
That's a good question. I think free, prior, and informed consent should be the initiating process. We've always said as Haudenosaunee people that the Band Council are service providers and they do not have a right to negotiate on land. So the land, any negotiations on land should come to the traditional Haudenosaunee people, a government that pre-existed before European arrival. Indigenous women are the title holders to the land under the Iroquois Confederacy's Great Law of Peace, Kayanaragoa. I know in other communities there are similar constitutions, but we do have a human rights-based approach under our traditional laws. And when we continue to evolve into continuing new forms of colonialism, that is not the answer. We could at least do the bare bones of free, prior, and informed consent, of consultations, real consultations, not just going through the motions of talking to an empty room or picking up the phone to the Band Council and asking whether or not they give permission. They need to be held accountable too as another level of government under the Indian Act. They have not been responsible. And so it creates that divide and conquer and the coercive ways of getting for developers to get their way. And that leaves us more vulnerable as Indigenous women. And it sort of it disrespects the authority and the traditional roles that Indigenous women play. So Indigenous women definitely have to be at the table for any kind of consultations, but also in the process of free, prior, and informed consent. Thank you.
I asked that because we spoke about, complaints coming forward about like sexual assault, decisions being made about lands in the absence of women's voices, Two-Spirit voices. And there's nowhere to go. So even when we do speak up, it's not a lack of will or certainly strength as Indigenous women and Two-Spirit. That's not our issue. But we really don't have a place to go, and our voices are marginalized. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that on top of that is the fear of reprisals if you do speak out, and this is coming from within and outside the community, especially given the circumstances we're living under here in Ganasadaga. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I have 20 seconds.
Yeah, you can just say your
anything
thank
else? Anything else you want to add? Sorry. I know it's kind of weird with the time. It's a little.
I think it's time to put. Yeah, we need to put action into words and not just apologies. We don't need any more. We don't need more apologies that do nothing.
I absolutely agree, especially since I'm about to apologize and to say I do have to cut everybody off. This has been such an incredible panel. I would really like to thank, on behalf of everybody on Status of Women, I would like to thank Martina, I'd like to thank Ellen, and I've got to find the other face. There you are, Hilda. Thank you so much for being part of this. I'm just going to remind everybody, we're going to now be switching into an in-camera. Everybody who is on Zoom, there is an additional link that has been sent to you with this meeting, so I'd ask that you go off this link and go on to the other link immediately. It will take a couple seconds to switch over. So we will suspend until we all get back. So on behalf of the committee, thank you very much. We're suspended and we'll see you back in a couple minutes.
you.